Larry Reed, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
I invited you here first and foremost because I wanted you to explain to me how and why Jesus was or was not a socialist.
I'd be happy to.
Was Jesus a socialist?
Well, the answer is absolutely no. And of course, much depends upon how you define socialism. Some people have a mistaken view that it's just an innocent but strongly held compassion for poor people. Lots of people have that, of all kinds of political and economic views. Socialism is the concentration of power in the hands of the state for the purpose of achieving objectives like the central planning of an economy or government ownership of the means of production or redistribution of wealth. All of that rests upon the use of force. There is not a single passage anywhere in the words of Jesus that suggests he would call in the government and its political power, its use of force, to solve any problem. He never once suggested that the way to fix a problem is to rob Peter to pay Paul or trust...
Literally.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And he knew them both. Or to trust politicians to plan an economy. I mean, that's so alien to his entire message. At the same time, I wouldn't say he was a capitalist either. To limit him to those words that didn't even come into existence for another 1,800 years after the crucifixion is to limit Jesus to but a fraction of who he was. But was he friendly to the ethics and the economics of freedom and free markets? Yeah, I think totally, and very opposed to the ethics and the economics of what we call socialism today.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation. You've given the conclusion, and now we are going to walk through it.
Okay.
And the reason I think that's important is multifold. So one is, if you look at polls today, and I know you look at these things, a substantial amount of young people believe that they have a positive view of not just the word socialism, but even communism, which used to be a word that was very much out of favor after the fall of the Soviet Union and all of the other sort of murderous communist societies that we as a species experimented with in the 20th century. Maoist China, Cambodia. We still have North Korea kicking around, starving its people every year. But I think it's over 25% of Gen Z, when asked in these polls if they think communism is a good idea or if they have a positive or negative view, they say positive.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that is about a belief in what those words mean when it comes to, am I being a good person? Am I caring?
Yeah.
Do I care about others? And I think that's one group of people that I think deserves to hear what you've got in your book and what you've spent your life working on. The other group, I think, are people, a lot of whom I think, are watchers of this show, who are deeply devout Christians and who see business and capitalism, they view it with a certain amount of skepticism and say, hey, I want to be a good person. I follow my Christian faith. And I'm being told, including by this Pope Francis, that business is greedy and markets are bad and sort of immorally corrosive. And so I'm for the values of sort of Christianity, but when you start talking about business and markets, I'm like, no, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I'm deeply skeptical, especially of big business, but maybe of business more broadly. So let's start to break this down for me. Like what, didn't Jesus like flip the tables over and, hate on the money changers? I brought you in as a Protestant because as a Catholic, I need you to explain the Bible passages because we don't read it.
That's for another day. But Jesus certainly overturned the tables of the money changers, but he did it at the temple. And that's the house of God. He never drove away the money changers from a bank or from a marketplace. this was not the place to be doing the things that they were doing, and presumably they may even have been disrupting services or at least entry to God's house. But when looking at socialism, I think there's a lot of sympathy for it because people are judging it by its stated intentions, not by its actual results. They're night and day. Because in terms of intentions, socialists often speak of helping the poor, being compassionate, doing good for others, thinking of others instead of yourself. Those things sound appealing to a lot of people. But it all comes down to how are you going to accomplish that? And the fact is that under what we would call capitalism, freedom and free markets, far more gets done for the poor and those who need special attention for various reasons, handicaps or whatever. Far more gets done for them under capitalism than is ever being done under socialism. And Jesus did tell us that we should consider the poor and to do what we can to help them. But if he came back today and asked an audience, okay, what did you do for the poor? I told you to pay attention to them. What did you do? He would not be impressed if you raised your hand and said, well, I just voted for the politicians who said they'd take care of that. He wanted to know, what are you going to do? If you stood up in that audience and said to Jesus that, well, I built a company and I hired lots of people who didn't have such opportunities before, or if you stood up and said, I invented things that saved lives, lengthened lives, I think he would be immensely proud of you. But he wouldn't be proud if you said, I just foisted the responsibility of the poor onto somebody else.
You define socialism as, essentially state ownership of the means of production, more or less.
Concentration of power, and that's one of the objectives, of course, yes.
The socialist, the self-described socialist, would take exception to that description, at least when it comes to power, and they would say, no, I am for power being centered with working people.
Yeah.
And that it's democracy that gives the power to the people, and that what we need to have is economic democracy. That's what we want. We want the people to be able to decide through their vote, which they all have equally, because one man, one vote, one person, one vote. But I think that is like the ethos and the argument. No, I'm not for. I don't think Bernie Sanders would say that he was for centralized power.
No, but what Bernie Sanders does not understand is that if you, in the name of democratic socialism, go down that path, you'll soon find yourself, at least you'll find the socialist objectives that you have at war with the democratic objectives. Because the more you trust the government to run the economy, to own the means of production, to all the things that socialists want the government to do, the more that tends to not only concentrate power, but it leads to corruption. I can think of no more toxic motivator than the desire for power, to push other people around, take their stuff, redistribute it, and then remind people at election time that it was you that gave them something. That's inherently corrupt. We've had many such experiments in so-called democratic socialism. And they all end up the same. I mean, Britain went down that path after World War II. I mean, it retained its democratic political institutions, but followed a socialist economic path. And barely 30 years later, you had Margaret Thatcher coming to power saying, we are the sick man of Europe. We've got to undo some of this. That is a pattern that's been repeated over and over and over again. You have to get rid of the high-sounding intentions and look at actually what a proposed system will do. What does it do? What's its track record? And socialism is a pretty sorry record.
I want to dig into the specifics of why and how that is a lot in this conversation. But before we do, I actually want to come back to the words of Christ. Help me understand how we could have a culture and have like a meme that Jesus was a socialist.
Yeah.
That to be Christian is to believe in social justice and equity and all of these things that they all sound nice. They're all beautifully branded.
Yeah.
What are the things that people derive from Christ that they misunderstand to be socialistic?
So often, John, I find in talking to people who think that Jesus was sympathetic to socialism, I find they really haven't read much of the Bible. I mean, if they did, they would find, for instance, in the book of Luke, Luke 12, 13 through 15, a man approaches Jesus with a request to redistribute wealth. He says, which is a socialist objective. He says, Master, speak to my brother that he divideth the inheritance with me. And Jesus does not respond by saying, oh, you mean you didn't get as much? Oh, we don't have equality here? Let me do something about that. No. He looks at the man and he says, man, who made me a judge or divider over you? Now, I mean, that's powerful. He's basically saying, what? You want me to take from some and give to others, or take from some guy, and, your brother, and give to you? I mean, who made me a judge or devoter? And he's the Son of God. I think, too, they're not looking at some of the parables that Jesus told. He told almost 40 parables. 3 are very strongly economic in content, and they make no case for a socialist arrangement of the economy. You have the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Yep.
When a man is walking along a road, he comes across another who's been beaten and robbed and clearly needs help. And what does the man do? He helps him. And we call him the Good Samaritan, not because he said to the man, there must be a government program for you, or I'll put a word in for you with the emperor. But instead, he pitches in with his own resources and of his own free will. He helps the man. He doesn't do anything that's remotely socialistic. He does it himself through his own initiative. That's why he's called the Good Samaritan. He would be known as the Good for Nothing Samaritan if he said, hey, there's got to be a government program for you.
And again, I think you could maybe say, well, it's an ethos of charity, right?
But it was never charity at gunpoint. Jesus never advocated charity by gunpoint. It should come from the heart. He was interested in what's in your heart, not what you are willing to foist onto somebody else as a responsibility. He told the parable of the talents, which I think is even more powerfully anti-socialist. And in this parable, he has an estate owner who's about to leave for a period of time. He gathers 3 of his employees together, gives them each a different quantity of his wealth, and he says, when I come back, we'll see what you've done with it. And Jesus has the estate owner come back and gather the same 3 guys, and he says, the first guy, what'd you do with what I trusted you with? And he says, oh, you'll be happy with me. I'm paraphrasing. I have just what you gave me. I didn't lose anything. And the estate owner criticizes him. He says, what? You didn't do anything with it? You didn't magnify it in any way? Then he goes to the second guy and says, what'd you do? And the guy says, I magnified it by making the right investments, and now I have 4 or 5 times what you trusted me with. He's praised in the parable. The third guy has like 10 times as much. He was even a wiser investor. and Jesus has the estate owner issuing the greatest praise to him. And then going one step further, saying, let's take the money from this first guy, this freeloader who didn't do anything with it, and give it to the third guy because he knows how to magnify wealth. You'd never have a socialist say anything like that.
This just reminds me of this concept, right? That, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Mm-hmm. So that's parable, what you're laying out there in the Bible, that says, no, if you have ability, you should actually be given more resources and responsibility. It's like the exact opposite.
Yeah.
How does that square with the concept of charity or selflessness? That I think is, again, I'm Catholic, so I can't quote the Bible like that, like you can. But I mean,
at least now you can read it.
I can read it. But I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and the couple of things that came out of that were, well, God is love. Uh-huh. Pretty awesome, pretty simple. And love your neighbor as yourself, among other things. Yep. And I know there is something that Christ does say, right? Which is how you treat the least of us is you treating me. Yeah. When you help another person, you are helping me. That is me that you're helping. And so that is an ethos of charity and of giving.
Yeah.
Not of maximizing return on investment. Right?
Well, quite often in a free economy or capitalist economy, the way to maximize your return is to serve customers, to have an ever increasing number of people who say, thanks for what you did. You made my life better. I'll buy from you another time. So there's nothing inherently incompatible with the creation and enjoyment of wealth and helping those in need. Jesus did advocate for the charitable impulse, but he never said the way to accomplish it is to employ the politicians to do it instead of you, to do it at gunpoint. It was always a gesture that he encouraged one and everyone to engage in it, but from the heart and with their own resources. He never said anything like, vote for the politicians who will do it and relieve you of that responsibility.
You said there was 3 parables that are especially powerful in this regard. What's
Yes.
the third?
The third is the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And this involves a man who owns apparently a large estate of grapes. It's harvest time. And he gathers a group of workers together early in a day. And he says, if you each go out and work the fields, I'll give you a denarius, which was a Roman coin, at the end of the day. And so they go off to work. And around noontime, the owner realizes he's got to get more people out in the field. So he brings another group together and he says, if you'll work the remainder of the day, I'll give you a denarius. And then finally, with maybe an hour to go before dark, he hires his last group of workers and offers them the same for effectively an hour of work. And then in this parable, Jesus has the estate owner gathering all the workers to be paid. And as you might imagine, the first group is grumbling. They're saying,
Right.
what? We worked all day and we got the same as the guys who showed up for an hour. And here's an opportunity for Jesus to make a socialist point, but he doesn't. What he does is he has the estate owner say to the workers, it's my money. It's my money. And then he goes on to say, didn't I give you what I promised? Didn't I meet the terms of our contract? Of course I did. And get out of here.
Scram.
Yeah. So I think that is a defense by way of a parable of things like private property, because the owner said, this is my money and we agreed to it. You know, it's a defense of the rights to voluntary contract. And I think probably a defense of supply and demand, because presumably at the end of the day, to get some people who may have already put in somewhere else,
Right.
to get them to come out, he had to pay them more. So there's nothing socialistic about that, whatever. It speaks to free enterprise.
In a reading of that text, what is the claim of the moral lesson? I mean, you've made some
Yeah.
very much through a lens that is very classical liberal. Oh, this is property rights. This is contract. He's even got terms.
Pretty clear.
He's rewarding marginal productivity.
He's got
There's a risk premium embedded in this. How is that parable more broadly understood that's still consistent with what it is? What's the simpler message of that parable?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that even those parables that have significant economic content, that they're entirely about economics. Every parable that Jesus told had a spiritual dimension. Everything he said had a spiritual dimension. So there are those who would dismiss the interpretation I've just offered you with an economic slant to it and say, well, no, he wasn't. This is all just allegorical. He was talking about spiritual matters. And
But what spiritual matters?
yeah, I'm not sure what they might say, but that's often a rebuttal, to which I always say, well, then why didn't Jesus tell at least one parable that, whatever its spiritual dimensions might be, had some socialistic economic messages in it? Because he didn't. He didn't tell any. So whether he meant it to be, this particular parable, to be entirely spiritual, entirely economic, or a mix of the two, which I think is most likely, he never told a parable that socialists can grab onto and say, see, he favors our kind of system.
There is this render unto Caesar what is Caesar and render unto God what is God's. I think I got that pretty close.
Yes.
What's that all about? That sure sounds like pay your taxes.
Yeah.
Is that not pay your taxes?
That's the way it's often interpreted. But if you look carefully at what Jesus had to say and the context, the context is that the Pharisees, who were always trying to trip him up, they wanted to try to get him to say something that they could run to the Romans with and say, see, he's a rebel or he's a tax evader, whatever. They produced the coin, had the image of Caesar on it, and wanted to know, what do we do with this, or to whom does it belong? And Jesus's reply is, I think, extraordinarily clever. He says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. He doesn't say how much or what belongs to Caesar. He leaves that to us. One view that's entirely compatible with what Jesus says in that passage would be that nothing belongs to Caesar. Maybe nothing does. I mean, surely you wouldn't argue that Jesus believed that it belongs to Caesar if he simply says it does, and even if he wants it all, and even if he blows it on destructive things. I mean, that doesn't sound very Christian either. Jesus didn't have a view on every earthly economic issue. He didn't give a lecture on interest rates and things like that. He was here for other reasons.
Darn it.
But he didn't give
Interest rates are too damn high.
That's right. He didn't give any stock tips or anything like that. He was always interested in what was going on in your heart. That was far more important than any kind of gesture to, I'm for the poor because I vote for the right politicians. He would say that doesn't prove anything because it doesn't involve any commitment on your part. What are you doing? So anyway, I keep coming back to that because Jesus was not an advocate of state action. He was interested in what you do because it came from your heart.
The golden rule. How do you understand what the golden rule is and how should we understand it?
The golden rule, which basically says, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, common to many faiths, not just Christianity. Some version of it is present in most major faiths. This, I think, is a recognition, a stated recognition that people are individuals, to begin with, is an important element here, that we're not collectivist blobs. We don't act as if we're part of the Borg, if you remember that from Star Trek.
Oh, yeah.
That instead we are unique and precious individuals, and therefore we should treat others the way we would want others to treat us. It's another way of saying something that Dr. Martin Luther King said, that we should judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin, and certainly not by the group they're in. This is a call from Jesus for things like fairness and justice and respect for other people and their property, because that's essentially what we're all about. Most people, if they don't cross the line into aggression against others, they want to be left alone, and they usually want to leave others alone. And that's essentially what the Golden Rule says.
I want to push on that a little bit.
Okay.
So do unto others as you would like to be done unto you. So if I want to be taken care of, or I want to be insured against risk, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. So life is uncertain. Bad things can happen to any of us, and it's often not up to us. We can get diseases, we can get hit by a bus, we can get robbed, and there's nothing we did to make that happen, to bring it upon ourselves. Couldn't the golden rule be used to justify, say, Social Security or an insurance scheme? Like, well, I would like us all to be insured against the worst. So isn't that the golden rule?
Well, it could be used to justify that sort of thing, but only if you take some parties out of the equation altogether and just ignore them. If to achieve your objective of helping you, yourself, or somebody else, you then have to find a third party to pick on, to take from, well, then you're not doing to that person what you would want them to do to you. But if it's all voluntary, I think Jesus would say, just don't use force. No charity at gunpoint is what's most compatible with Jesus' teaching. So do unto others as you would have others do unto you is not a license to find some third party that you can rip off so you can accomplish your objectives.
I have a friend that has converted to Islam, and we've been getting into this very interesting. I actually want to bring some people on to educate me on Islam, because I'm learning things that I really don't know anything about. But one of the things he's said, and there might be others who would say, no, he's wrong, is we're going to win, we being Islam globalists, let's say, what he would consider himself to be like. He thinks we're in a religious struggle for the planet. Mm-hmm. We're going to win because you Christians are a bunch of pacifists. You worship a guy that let himself get hung on the cross and die. Is that correct? I don't mean his global geopolitics, but is it right to see Christ and his sacrifice as pacifism?
No, and yet I know there are plenty of people who think that Jesus was some sort of a weak, namby-pamby, a rollover for anything kind of person, but it was hardly that at all. I don't know of another person who ever existed who exhibited more courage than Jesus did, who endured more physical pain on behalf of the sins of others than Jesus did. I think he was a pillar of strength. even at his lowest moment at Gethsemane and on the cross, when he seemed to have momentary second thoughts, perhaps, he rallied and said, "I'm here for a purpose," and he accomplished it. So I would be wary of anybody who says we're going to win because they seem to think they know what the future holds. There were a lot of Muslims who probably said that in the 7th century. It hasn't worked out that way since. So don't know what the future holds, and we're mortals. So I shy away from predicting it, but I have every confidence that the message of Jesus and the life he lived are models of strength and of character. You know, by the way, at the Last Supper, when the night before he was crucified, he said to his disciples, "If you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and get one."
Really? I don't remember this.
In other words, that doesn't sound like an advocate for sword control. I mean, he's basically saying, you know, you may need it. I've got a purpose. I've got to go my way. But in your case, you may need some defensive protection. So get a sword if you haven't got one. That doesn't sound like the words of a weakling or a pacifist.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, I guess if I'm to put myself in that moment, it's like, here you have your disciples who you've spent your adult life now training to take this message out of the world. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, oh, I know that I'm going to get put to death. I'd rather my message not die with me.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and if I can
arm up.
Exactly. If I can prolong my life and therefore tell more people of the great message I'm here to carry forth with, I'm going to defend myself. Jesus was an advocate for that.
What other elements of the story of Christ and of Christianity do you feel like someone who's leaning towards this liberation theology needs to hear and understand? I
think it would have to be this. And this is at the same time, it's incredibly simple. It is immensely profound. It goes to the very nature of we humans. How were we created? Are we a fleet of robots programmed in every detail by some central commander, or are we created in the image of God, but as separate, distinct, and precious individuals? It's clearly the latter. And that's magnificent. There are endless implications to that. Because what it means is, since you are so unique that there's no other person that we have any reason to believe who was ever present on this earth who was exactly identical to you, and never will be. That's how unique every single person is. That means for you to be who you are, you can't be just carrying out orders of some central commander. You have to be given considerable control over your choices and your life. That's profoundly important. Jesus didn't come to tell everybody, march in goose step in a collective blob. He came to celebrate the individual, to bring the individual to salvation as a matter of personal choice, one at a time. I want to dig into free will, which is what you're talking about. But there's one piece of this that I've heard from people of faith, and actually I hear it the most from people who are really tapped into it. And that is the concept of surrendering to Christ, turning yourself over and saying, "Thy will be done." It's in our prayers. That doesn't sound like freedom. It sounds like definitionally not freedom. So help me understand how to square individual free will and freedom with surrender. At no point in his message did Jesus ever suggest that you should be brought to salvation or to an acceptance of him through any degree of coercion. That is always left to the individual. You decide. You can go the other way if you want. There are consequences for it, but you can choose to go the other way. I don't think Jesus ever took away or suggested that we should take away the individual's right to choose on such an important, critically important matter of where you want to spend eternity, whether or not you'll accept him. And if he really was who he said he was, the Son of God, why wouldn't you want to surrender to him? because by definition, he was pure, he was righteous, he was, in every way a perfect model for any society. But nonetheless, you could choose to go another way because we have free will.
How do you think personally about this idea of surrendering to your faith and to God? How do you does that resonate with you? I'm going to be honest that I don't know that I've until recently, actually. Let me put that another way. I've started to feel callings that are kind of irrational.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm doing this.
Yeah.
But how do you relate to this idea?
Well, first of all, I believe Jesus was who he said he was. And so that puts me in a frame of mind to want to do his bidding. I recognize that that's still very much a personal choice. And I recognize that even though I have said yes to that as a commitment, that I often fail at it, that I fall short. Jesus told us we would. We're not perfect. But nonetheless, I think it's a wonderful thing that's a choice that each of us have. And but we are flawed human beings in a fallen world. And so we're going to make mistakes all the time. But we should learn from them. But the essential core of Christianity, of belief that there was a creator, is a creator, that he sent his only begotten Son to forgive us through his sacrifice of the sins we've committed, is a marvelous, otherworldly matter that I just thank him for every day of the week. I may have gotten off the subject there, but that's where I'm coming from on that.
It's so strange and powerful, this claim, right?
Yeah.
To say, it's like packed with mysteries. So why would this happen this way?
Yeah.
Like everything about the story, in one sense, challenges the rational mind.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm going to send, the creator of the universe, will have the embodiment of me that's at once separate but not separate. We can get into like the Trinity, and there's all these sort of metaphysical things there. But I'm going to send my son down, and it's going to go real bad.
Yeah.
For him.
Well, there's always...
As a lesson.
Yeah. There will always be great mystery surrounding matters of faith. I suppose God could settle that if he just suddenly appeared in the sky with a huge booming voice and a scary visage telling us, hey, get right with me and do what I told you. And then there wouldn't be any room for faith, right? Because obviously, how can you dispute something that everybody saw with their own eyes? But with matters of faith, there will always be this mystery because that's what gives you the room to choose another path. And that's what makes the choice of following Jesus so important, so wonderful, that you've made a choice, and this is what it is, and you could have gone another way, but he gave you the ability to see it through and to make a choice. So a lot of the criticism of the way the world is, or the way God chose to redeem us through his Son, I think is akin to the clay kind of dissing the potter, like saying, well, I don't like the painting, so I don't think there was a painter. I mean, how much sense would that make? God set up things as they are with certain rules and a framework, and we don't necessarily know every detail of why or how, but we sure know enough to decide whether or not we want to follow him or something else or nothing.
To come back to the economics of Jesus for a little bit, help me understand this relationship with the notion of greed. And let's start with this phrase, the meek shall inherit the earth.
Yeah.
And blessed be the poor.
Yeah.
There's Christ focuses on the poor. He admonishes the wealthy at different points.
Yeah.
For lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why one could say, like, well, you guys are cherry picking a couple parables, but look at the big picture. He was always beating up on rich people and saying, we need to take care of the poor, and that's how I'll judge you, is how you took care of the poor. So isn't that really still kind of a socialistic deal?
Well, in his day, to be rich in Palestine 2,000 years ago was almost invariably to be rich because of political power and political connections. Not to be rich in the way we think of it today as a result of an entrepreneurial decision to make investments and employ people and create new products. That was a concept that came long after the crucifixion. So the rich kind of had, in almost every case, a few points against them right from the get-go because they tended to be involved with the political power of the state.
Sort of aristocracy.
Yeah, but Jesus never said that whether you will enjoy eternal life will depend upon the size of your bank account. Never said that. Doesn't matter the size of your bank account. What he was warning against were the temptations that come with wealth. There's no question that wealth brings, even honestly gained wealth, brings with it great temptation. Wealth that comes your way suddenly and massively, I think carries even more temptations because it's such a massive change in your lifestyle. And you're suddenly faced with all kinds of decisions and temptations. So Jesus was saying, don't let wealth run you. Don't worship wealth. Use it to advantage. Put it to good work, like the parable of the talents. Use it constructively. Solve problems with it. Create enterprises. Employ people. Create products. Add value. That's what Jesus was saying, and that's what we do in a capitalist system. But he never said that being wealthy in and of itself is a sin. It's allowing your wealth to control you that is the sin. The phrase, money is the root of all evil, often comes up. And that was said not by Jesus, but by Paul, but not even quite that way. What Paul said was the love of money is the root of all evil, not money itself. I mean, can you imagine what kind of an economist would Paul be if he said, this stuff, this medium of exchange stuff that facilitates trade and makes possible all kinds of commercial activity, no, that's inherently evil. He never said that. He said loving it, worshiping it, letting it control you, that's the evil.
What is it in us that leads us towards that love of the material? This is one of the things at the heart of skepticism about free markets, free enterprise, capitalism, even though like we've both adopted the Marx term, capitalism. Mm-hmm. What is it in our nature that I think causes material wealth to have this seed of corruption in it, do you think?
We do have a sin nature to begin with, so there is a tendency, will always be a tendency to cast our eyes off of the real prize, the Creator and His commandments, and to pay attention instead to physical materiality, because that's what makes life so enjoyable, at least in the short run.
Hedonism.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we have an innate tendency to have a lust for material things. But the desire to do better, to build a bigger factory, employ more people, add more value is not inherently sinful at all. Nothing in Jesus' words would ever suggest that. But he was saying, don't forget how that all came to be. Remember that I'm the author of all things, so in a sense, everything still belongs to me. Don't get so haughty as to think that these material things can be a good substitute for looking to God the Creator. But it's just how far you take it. Jesus never says that it's inherently bad to want to create wealth. It's just inherently bad to worship it and to do so at the expense of keeping your eyes on the real prize.
What is greed?
It's one of those things that I think has a million shades to it. Most people would say if you simply want to do better, if you want to set up a lemonade stand and you want to get more customers and make more money at the end of the day by providing a good that people want, they would say, well, that's not greed. But most people would agree, and I would, that it is greed if you will do anything to satisfy it. If you will be deceptive, commit fraud, use force, intimidation, deprive anyone else of their equal rights to life and property, to satisfy your desire for material things, you can call that greed and a lot of other bad things too. It's a matter of where are you focused primarily, material things or things of the spirit, as Calvin Coolidge would say. and whether or not you worship those material things or worship the creator who made it all possible.
The sense in which, it's like there's the famous like Gordon Gekko speech, greed is good, greed is right. Is there any, in your view, truth to the concern that competition, which is part of the fundamental part of the marketplace, is to be competitive, to want to, in any given moment, you are competing for attention, for the customer, for the client, for a bank loan. And so that drive, that striving, is there any part of that where too much of that energy shades into something that's morally a problem, even if it's not technically fraud or hurting others? I mean, if you and I are bidding on a job, and the person's only going to hire one of us, I want to win. I want you to lose.
Yeah.
So doesn't that set up, isn't it better if we just cooperate? Then isn't that sort of greed? Doesn't that end up being greed, even if it's not greed the way you're describing it?
Well, within the parameters that I've already outlined, not allowing your desire for material progress to come at the expense of anyone else's rights, or coming at the expense of your keeping your eyes on the prize, so to speak. In fact, I think competition and cooperation are really, in a free market, one and the same. Think of it this way. Somebody who's out there trying to produce a better product that more people will want, and they'll want it even more than the other guy's product. I mean, that's competition, but it's also maximum cooperation. You're cooperating with all these customers that you're trying to please, more so than the other guy is. I mean, that's cooperation. Maybe not with a competitor, but it certainly is with the masses of customers that you're seeking. But also remember that if you think that capitalism accentuates greed, and you think that the answer to it, as so many seem to believe, is to set up some kind of a socialist or quasi-socialist system, you're not likely to do anything to reduce the quantity of greed in society. Socialist societies don't eliminate greed. They just channel it into destructive directions. People are just as greedy under socialism. It's just that the way to satisfy their greed is to use the political process, get favors from the government, call the cops on your competition, do all the kinds of nasty things that reasonable people would oppose. So at the same time you judge a system like capitalism, you should also think about, well, what would the alternative do on this issue? And I don't know of a socialist system that ever has done away with greed, just drives it underground and drives it into destructive directions.
I heard an interesting sort of example of this played out in a unique space, which is there's a game company called Riot Games. They were actually managed by a sort of anarcho-syndicalist, sort of like a anarchist, but that believes in sort of communal structures as opposed to like a Murray Rothbard type. So he said, look, this game company, and there's obviously lots of companies that have really decentralized management structures, like leaderless.
Yeah.
That was the claim. This is a leaderless structure. In fact, all of the desks had caster wheels on them, and you could move things around. Nobody has any titles.
Workers are in charge because everybody's a worker.
And so, people like to romanticize co-ops for this reason. He said, here is the problem, is much like everyone gets a trophy, everyone kind of was still keeping score right below the surface. And it was actually a deeply political environment to work in because there was a score being kept. It was just not direct. It was not obvious. Yeah. And so you were jockeying and spending more time on things that had nothing to do with, like, are you writing better code? Are you designing better art? Yeah. And it is interesting. There is this tension between our competitive nature and our, maybe I would rather than say cooperative, our self-directed nature. Our, I'm going to do the best just because I want to.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a motivation I think Jesus would be perfectly comfortable with. You want to do your best because it's part of your nature. What's wrong with wanting to do better? What's wrong with taking the talents that you were blessed with and putting them to maximum use, as long as they do no harm to another person? I think that's what life is all about. It's all about character building. All the time you have here on the planet, you're not supposed to end up at the end of it all worse off than when you started. You're supposed to be able to look back and say, I added value. The world is better because I was in it for a time.
You are the president emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education.
Yes.
And it's one of the oldest organizations dedicated to promoting free enterprise.
Yep.
In fact, I remember when I was working on these, I had a script of the first Keynes versus Hayek rap battle.
Mm-hmm.
I went to the fee offices in New York because God rest his soul, Steve Horwitz was there, and I knew he would understand whether I got all the lyrics right in this rap. And I went and showed it to him, and he's like, "Oh, this is pretty good." So, but fee, it has been this beacon for a long time as the promoter of these ideas. There's a lot of organizations out there now that do it. How did you get into this free enterprise philosophy? What, especially as someone who's obviously a very passionate Christian, and really it's really clearly at the center of how you think about your life.
Well, I have often thought about this. I didn't have, ironclad political direction from either parent. My mother was never interested in current events or politics or history or any of that sort of thing. My dad had the right instincts. He didn't like authoritarians in any walk of life, and he was very much a rugged individualist, an entrepreneur.
What did your dad do?
He ran, first thing he did was he went into business with his brother, my Uncle Ralph, in an excavating business, and bought a large portion of land outside of Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. Later it was called the Reed Plan because they bought this land together and then did the excavations for all the basements in the lots that they then sold to people who wanted to build a home. But then later he went into the business of a plumbing, heating, and industrial supplies store in Rochester, Pennsylvania, selling pipe and fittings, and mostly to plumbers, but also to the general public. And it was in 1968 that I became alive with these ideas of liberty when the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies invaded Czechoslovakia. I had been following the events of Prague Spring, the unraveling of the communist dictatorship in the first part of '68, fascinated about these people in this tiny country throwing off the yoke of control, wanting to be freed, even now talking about free elections in a country that hadn't had them for 25 years or more. And when the Soviets invaded, I was livid with rage. And within a few days, I saw a little blurb in our local paper saying that a youth group was going to have a demonstration in downtown Pittsburgh to protest the Soviet invasion. And being just 20 miles away, I bought a bus ticket, went up to Pittsburgh, joined the organization called Young Americans for Freedom at that time. And one of the first things that happened when you joined YAF way back when was you got a box in the mail of publications from the Foundation for Economic Education. Copies of its magazine, books by F.A. Hayek, the Nobel Prize winner, Austrian economist, Frederick Bastiat's The Law,
Great.
Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. And the message was, if you want to be opposed to tanks in the street, Soviet invasions, you got to know your economics, your moral philosophy, and your history. And so I devoured it, and at some point not long thereafter, I said, whatever I do in life, it's going to involve advocating for liberty in some way, because at least by television saw what happens when people are deprived of it.
That's a weird story.
Yeah.
What is it about some distant freedom fighting? How old were you at this time?
I was in '68. I was 13.
So you're a 13-year-old, like typical, like Ozzie and Harriet, American boy. Your dad works in, construction supply.
Yeah.
And you're riveted by freedom fighting in Eastern Europe.
Well, I think it's the instincts that my dad had that rubbed off on me. I can give you two quick stories. I remember in the third grade, so I would have been about 8, he wanted to take me to Florida for a week in February. And I said something to the teacher about, I'm going to be in Florida for a week. And she said, he can't do that. You can't go. I'm going to have the principal call. And sure enough, the principal did call, and I could only hear my dad's side of the phone conversation. But I remember like it was yesterday. My dad listened patiently. And then at one point he said, now you listen to me. He's my son. We're going to Florida. Don't call here again," and hung up. He was my hero. And then, do you know, Pennsylvania has had for years, maybe it's relaxed today, but they used to have laws against bringing milk in from neighboring states and selling it in Pennsylvania.
Of course.
Who lobbied for that? Yeah.
Right. Gee, I wonder.
Pennsylvania dairy farmers. Well, my dad, if he didn't see any good sense to a law, he thought the first rule was to break it. And so we lived 11 miles from the Ohio border, and he would make arrangements with neighbors that, hey, you need a gallon of milk or a couple of gallons, I'll sell it to you for 20 cents cheaper. We would go over on a Saturday morning.
So he was a milk bootlegger in eastern Pennsylvania.
Milk smuggler. And I remember we would buy milk in quantity in Negley, Ohio, and then drive across the border back to home. And he always made it a thrill. He would tell my sister and I, keep the blanket on top of the milk. If we get pulled over, don't tell the cop, what we've got in the back. So we thought it was great fun. And looking back on it, I think that planted the seeds of an anti-authoritarianism. If you want to push me around, tell me what I can do with my life when I'm engaged in peaceful, mutually beneficial commerce, you better make a darn good case for it. And I certainly didn't see any case for what the Soviets were doing in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But my dad planted those seeds.
One way to look at Christ is that he was a rebel and a convict that was ultimately put to death by the state. If Jesus wasn't a socialist, was he an anarchist?
Jesus never said, now, here's my version of a constitution that you ought to have with all the proper structures of government. He never dealt in that kind of detail. He wasn't here for that purpose. He outlined some elemental universal principles of things like justice and fairness, which I think our founders in America extrapolated when they wrote the Declaration and then the Constitution. They were trying to bring a lot of what Jesus had to say, I think, into reality as they understood his teachings on things like private property and rule of law and what have you. But Jesus didn't take a position on every nitpick and detail of the nature, size, scope, intrusiveness of government, what his proper level of taxation should be. I mean, they left that to us.
How do you see the relationship between faith and this philosophy of freedom, of the Declaration of Independence? We called this show Dad Saves America because I think what America is ultimately is not its geography, but it is a set of principles. It's maybe the first country to be born on the basis of like a philosophical argument.
Yeah.
That Declaration of Independence is, Gordon Wood said, it was a radical declaration from a group of radicals who were colonists of the radical Britain, because relative to the rest of the world at the time, Britain was radically freedom, individualistic oriented, and then the Americans, forget about it. How do these two philosophies come together for you and work together?
I've never seen the ideas of, say, the political ideas of the founders of this country as in any way incompatible with the teachings, as I understand it, the economics and ethics of Jesus' teachings. Now, many of our founders were not Presbyterian or Catholic or consider themselves deists. They just felt that there was a creator, but that he otherwise walked away and left us alone. There are varying perspectives among our founders. But I've just never seen anything incompatible between ideas of freedom and free markets on the one hand and Christianity on the other. Now, there were times, in fact, even to this day, every now and then I'll have a doubt on the Christian side of things. I'll say, now, why would God do that? That doesn't seem right to me. But I often say, well, wait a minute, I am a mortal human being. I'm not made to understand everything, but I get the big picture. But I still have occasional doubts. I think that's anybody endowed with free will and a discerning mind is always going to have doubts. I just wish socialists would have a few doubts, but they always seem to think you put the government in charge and everything will be just peachy.
So long as we all vote for it.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah,
somehow. Or get active or take to the streets or be engaged.
That's right. And I'm grateful that we have a, quote, democratic system. But remember that it's been said before that democracy can be a little like two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for lunch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing that has been lost in our civics is that the fundamental structure of our Constitution is to say, actually, no. Here's a bunch of things you can't do.
Yeah,
as a majority.
exactly. Yeah, if we were a true democracy, everything would be up for a popular vote all the time. But we have a republic with democratic institutions. We elect members of Congress, and you win a seat if you get 50% plus one of the votes. But then you go and you represent as best you can the views of the folks back home who can call you back and diselect you the next time around if you don't do what they sent you there to do. So we have democratic elements, but our system is properly called a republic, not a democracy.
You mentioned it, and we've talked about it a couple times. Free will. So I recently went through the adult sort of like Catholicism training with my son because he didn't go to Catholic school. And I was like, well, before you leave the house, I made a commitment that you're going to go through the Catholic sacraments. And he was amenable to doing that. And so we did it. And one of the things that came out of that was striking to me and consistent with your book and with your understanding of Christianity is that, you know, at least in the Catholic Church, free will and reason are crucially important things that we are called to make use of. And that actually our moral choice is predicated on it being free.
Yeah.
That we can't have moral action coerced by another.
That's
if
right.
I point a gun at you and say, help this person, your action is not moral. You aren't being charitable.
Exactly. And you don't make a person religious by taking them to church at gunpoint. Everything hinges upon what comes from the person's heart.
How central is our free will both to your understanding of Christianity and of like liberty and freedom more broadly?
They are inseparable. I think free will is at the very core of liberty. Liberty would make no sense, in fact, if we were either all the same or if our decisions were all predetermined, if we had no say in them, if we couldn't choose one thing over another, even if it's bad. Those things naturally follow from a situation in which you have substantial agency over your life. I think that's the way we were created.
The gauntlet that gets thrown is for those who are skeptical of free markets, this sort of philosophy we're talking is that, look, you guys are talking about God and freedom, but there's a lot of like horrible circumstances that people end up in of no fault of their own. They didn't choose them. They didn't choose to be born with a debilitating disease or into a home with no dad or an abusive dad or mom. We live in a world full of suffering.
Yes.
And so shouldn't we temper our celebration of freedom and free will given the role that luck plays in all of our lives? Isn't luck kind of a big deal? And you know, wouldn't that be the ultimate argument against what we're saying? Like, you know, it's a roll of the dice.
Well, you know, if there were angels out there that we could vote for, that we could trust to run our lives better than we can ourselves to make sure that those bad outcomes don't happen, I would say, maybe we should give that a look. But they're not there. And so then we have the question, well, in a fallen world, what are the best ways to show compassion for the truly needy, to help those who are in problems through no fault of their own? Well, I think one is to have the freest possible economy, because that's the most proven formula for baking a bigger pie. And secondly, encouraging the kind of moral virtues that prompt people then to say, here's a needy person, I like to pitch in, I want to help. I don't need the state to do it, I can do it, like the Good Samaritan did. I mean, those are the kinds of values and virtues we should encourage, but you don't do that, I think, by expecting politicians to exhibit them. They're subject to all kinds of temptations once they have power at their disposal. And to the extent they solve a problem, they tend to do it at 4 or 5 times the cost if you or I were to try to solve it. So you have to look at the alternatives. But certainly
But isn't 4 to 5 times the cost better than something not happening at all because it's a market failure or because of its collective action problem? There's all sorts of like
well, there's
traps
yeah.
that we've been told are set for freedom.
The world's not perfect, that's right. And the same traps I could set for a socialized society. I could say you're going to have all kinds of people fall through the cracks because they don't have the political connections. You're going to have all kinds of people fall through the cracks. You're going to have bread lines like they did in the old Soviet Union. So poor people found it hard to get something as simple as a loaf of bread. Not because the state didn't pretend to be compassionate. It did. It said that's why we're here, to help people. But the end result was not that at all. You have to judge these systems by results, not just stated intentions. But the same token, John, I'm the first to say that a free society only works to the extent you are also a largely virtuous society. People who lose their virtue, lose their character, will ultimately lose their liberties and may even lose their lives. And I don't know of any society in all of history in which people lost their virtue or lost their character and kept their liberties.
I want to dig into this. This has been something, this is one of the reasons why I was excited to have you on. Because there's not enough voices out there, in my opinion, who are absolutely loud advocates for radical liberty, for free enterprise, for freedom of choice along virtually every dimension, who aren't, and who are as committed to trying to like celebrate character as you are. It's been something. It's been part of your writing and your speeches for a long, long time. I've always, and actually, frankly, when I first got into like these libertarian type ideas, it wasn't as appealing to me. Maybe it's because I'm now like a graybeard dad. I'm like, no, character matters.
Yeah.
But what is character?
Character is a cluster, you might say, of personality traits that you largely develop over your life and can change depending upon what's going on up here. I mean, you can choose to be honest or you can choose to be dishonest. I would argue that a person of solid, strong character is also an honest person. And I also would argue that a society of largely dishonest people is not likely to be a free society. The chaos that would result from a dishonest society will lead to some strong man knocking heads together and bringing order out of the chaos. Honesty is one of those character virtues that make for strong, positive character. Another is intellectual humility. This is the idea that you recognize that as much as you may know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. Mm-hmm. That's to be contrasted with a kind of meddlesome, know-it-all, busybody mentality that I know I can live your life better than you. Intellectual humility makes you a person want to then focus on improving himself. Another attribute of strong character is responsibility. Can you imagine a society of irresponsible people? Everybody would be running around saying it's your fault, even if it was mine. Or give me a bailout, I'm entitled, I want something from you, don't ask for anything from me, I just want it from you.
It reminds me of the quote from Bastiat, the state is the fiction by which each of us seeks to live at the expense of all of us.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like, wait a second, let me do the math on this. We're all going to seek to live at the expense of someone else.
Yep.
Well, at some point, that breaks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, where's the someone on Mars? The Martians? How are we going to...
Well said, but Bastiat said it even better. Also, gratitude. You know, I think often we forget how important an attitude this is. The notion that you recognize, if you have a grateful spirit, it means you recognize that not all the good things that have come your way have been of your own doing.
Why is that so important? Why is gratitude important?
If you want to encourage good things in society, you've got to offer praise when it's warranted. You've got to recognize others who've done a good thing. You've got to say a thank you to them. Otherwise, you're sort of saying, you're not important, it's just me, and maybe I did it, maybe it wasn't you at all. I think expressing gratitude is a way of encouraging something good that someone has done for you. And have you ever noticed that the icons of the left are not grateful people? They're typically very unhappy, ungrateful people. Can you imagine Karl Marx ever walking into a hardware store and saying to the owner, thank you for taking the risk to create this enterprise and hiring these people and making sure all the products I want are on the shelf when I need them. He would never do that. He would just lecture you on why you're exploiting people.
Well, we have his letters, and he would also turn around and once again ask for more money from his
From Friedrich Engels.
from Engels' dad.
Yeah, he was a lifelong
parasite guy. It's like a
Yeah,
interesting thinker, kind of a dirty parasite of and an anti-Semite and all kinds of other
and a
horrible stuff.
racist and just angry at everything all the time. In the world he thought was divided between victims and oppressors, as if that's it. You know, he never wrote about good things from anybody.
My son read the Communist Manifesto in middle school by choice because he was at Acton Academy, so he got to pick the books he wanted to read. And after he was done reading it, I asked him, so, you know, what's your takeaway from reading that book? And it's not the same as Das Kapital, but he said, well, it just seems like he hates rich people. I was like, yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, exactly. He was motivated by not pulling himself up, but dragging somebody else down, whether it be the rich or any number of others. Another attribute that's important to character, especially in a dangerous world, is courage. And of course, Jesus had courage. And thank God we've had people throughout history who, when it really mattered, when courage was required, stepped up to the plate and did things that the rest of us could only look at in awe. One of the most courageous people I've ever known about, never met him, he died in 1948, was Polish, Witold Pilecki, who volunteered to get arrested by the Germans after they invaded Poland in 1939, in the hope that they would send him to this big sprawling place that we now know as Auschwitz to find out from the inside what was going on there. He had no assurance that he wouldn't simply be shot, but he got his wish. He got sent to Auschwitz, and from the inside, for 3 years, he created a resistance movement, stealing documents, smuggling them out.
Wow.
And then later did what only 143 other people ever did, successfully escaped from Auschwitz, joined the war effort in the Battle of Warsaw, captured by the Germans who, because he wasn't Jewish, didn't have the markings that would betray he'd been in a concentration camp. They just threw him in a POW camp. And then when the war was over, he was stationed by the Polish army in Italy when the Poles said, that doesn't look like the Soviets are going to leave. We need somebody back on the inside. So they send Pilecki to go spy on the Russians in his own country for 2 years, which he did. And he was eventually caught and executed. But wow, shouldn't we be grateful that there are such courageous people from time to time in history who set such an example for the rest of us?
It's really interesting to think about courage and how you get more of it.
Yeah.
Courage is one of the things we're in deficit now. But it just seems to me like we are so wealthy as a society in America and the broader first world, Western world. Mm-hmm. Is it easier to be courageous when your back's against the wall, when you're Polish and the Germans are invading? Is that because it's survival instinct? Yeah. How do you think about the development of courage in the modern wealthy age? How do we do it?
I think there is something about being very prosperous, maybe even being at the top of the world in so many ways for so many decades, that does not lend itself to the development of courage. If you've got everything, then I think instinctively maybe many people will think, well, what do I need courage for? I've got it all. It takes some discernment. It takes some knowledge of history. It takes some understanding of what the world is really all about for people to develop courage in otherwise very positive, good times. But this remains a dangerous world, always has been. The world has always been full of people who, if given the chance, would take your property, would take your rights, would take your life. And they exist not only in our midst, but overseas as well. And so people who want to retain their freedom and their prosperity, I think had better be on the alert at both the enemies from within and the enemies from without. And that means courage, speaking truth to power, as one element of courage, is always required. And when you suggest maybe that we're losing some of that, I agree with it. And you asked how do we teach it or encourage it. One way, I think, is people have to be better informed about the courageous people of the present day as well as those of the past. So I'm a great advocate of reading great biographies of great men and women who have exhibited such traits as courage under fire. And I've written a book called Real Heroes, and courage is a common theme throughout all 40 chapters. If you don't have role models to look up to, you won't have role models you venerate or try to emulate. So, recognizing that courage is a trait that some have possessed who have made the world a better place and without whom it's unimaginable where we'd be. I think that's the beginning of it. You'll come to appreciate it if you study it in people.
I think there's a saying, there's no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah.
I was tripping over myself because I felt like there was a Keynesian equivalent to that somewhere in my head rattling around. But there is this saying, there's no atheists in foxholes. To what extent do you feel like faith is like that? And is that good or bad? Is it a crutch for the human animal?
Well, the Bible talks in several places about how people lost their faith, ultimately came back to it, maybe not that same generation, but a later generation, but only after experiencing some real challenges. I think God sometimes says, look, you have strayed so far, you've got to suffer the consequences of your misbehavior before you see the light. And because he's a just God, he doesn't say you can do a lot of unjust things without any consequences. But sometimes as flawed human beings, we don't come around to doing the right thing or believing the right way until we've had to suffer the consequences of our misbehavior.
This is one of the things that for me, I've found myself being drawn back to my Catholicism around. And it's actually the cross. It's actually the lesson to tie these ideas together a little bit. Yeah. That in a very comfortable, wealthy society, I live a privileged life. This is my job. This is completely ridiculous that I can sit here and have a conversation with someone I really like, and that is my job. Like, that's bizarre. Like, I'd be fine digging ditches. I'm Italian. I like doing physical labor, but I don't. I have something better than that. I don't have a lot of crosses to bear. But the image of the cross says, oh, you will, and B, even he did.
Yeah.
So here you go to church, and it's like, well, this is the Son of God, and he's laying there, he's like this, bleeding with a, crown of thorns. It's macabre, it's grotesque, and I think that it is powerful in ways that I didn't appreciate growing up.
Yeah.
Because it says, or one way you can interpret it, which is the way I choose to, is we'll all face these moments.
Yeah.
And so even he did.
And it's a statement of love, isn't it? For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. Jesus went to the crucifixion not out of contempt for human society, but rather for love of human society. He freely chose to make the supreme sacrifice so that you and I could be forgiven of sins for which we were both guilty and deserving of great punishment. I think that's, isn't that an amazing thing? What a wonderful gift that is. Do we realize how powerful that is? I think many of us don't sometimes.
I think it's such a useful reminder, and I think it's one of these things where the more comfortable life becomes, the more valuable and essential it is to be reminded that we actually, not only will we face challenges and trials that can be very painful, not the least of which being that, God willing, because I know my parents want me to outlive them.
Yeah.
That's what they want, just like I want my son to outlive me. But baked into that is knowing that we want the people we love the most to suffer through our own deaths.
Yeah.
That my parents want me to see them die.
Yeah.
Because that is the cost that is inescapable in me surviving.
Yeah.
And that is such a powerful, again, to speak to like the love of the father and mother. It's a really powerful reminder of that to
Yeah,
me.
I think so.
You've written a book asking a question, provocative question, that I think has become a bit of a meme now. Are we Rome?
Yes.
What is that question? What did you mean by that question? And is it true?
Well, since high school, I think I have heard from teachers and other people allusions to parallels between ancient Rome and America. And the parallels that I have heard have not been encouraging. That the argument being that we are echoing the mistakes of Rome, and as a result, will sooner or later suffer the consequences, as Rome did, of its misbehavior. So I have delved into that at great length and discovered a number of things. First of all, Rome was very different in the age of the emperors, the last 500 years of ancient Rome, than it was from the first 500 years when it was a republic. It was a very different place when Roman liberty and society decayed to the point where they were willing to embrace dictatorship. But those first 500 years as a republic, there are many similarities between American society and ancient Rome. Just like the Romans, we were born in revolt against central authority. And when the Romans overthrew their seventh of seven kings, they said, we don't want any more monarchy. That's essentially what Americans did. They set up a republic, which involved a Senate of noble representatives from nobility, but also popularly elected assemblies. They dispersed power. They said, we don't want any one person to have anything like the kind of power our kings had, so we're going to have two guys at the top called consuls, and each one can veto the decisions of the other, and both of them are limited to 1 year. I mean, so they built an apparatus of separation of powers, checks and balances. They invented the veto and habeas corpus and the things that our founders later wanted to bake into our system. But our founders not only knew the strengths of ancient Rome, they knew also why Rome eventually lost it all. They knew that if government ever got to the point where people saw it as their savior, as the provider of all things, as the source of virtue, that the result would be corruption, disaster, and loss of liberty. They were hoping they could create a system that improved on what the Roman Republic did, and those consequences could be forestalled. But the jury is still out on that. How good are we at avoiding Roman consequences? So far, we've done a lot of the same things they stupidly did, and we're suffering a lot of the same consequences.
One of the things that's been happening, on the right has been an increasing interest in using government to enforce essentially Christian morality in some sense. And I don't want to overplay that, the claims of this, the sort of national conservative movement, but it seems like there's some people who sound an awful lot like Elizabeth Warren, who call themselves conservatives and Christians, who need this book just as much as people who are like
I agree.
on college campuses. What do you make of that? How do we pull them back from that? how do we engage with this set of ideas? What's going on there?
Yeah, there's a populist streak, I think, infecting our politics, which is a kind of appeal to present gratification, to some of our less noble instincts of finding some group out there to dislike and vilify them. People on both sides of the political fence are doing that all the time. We've broken down what we used to say was a pretty solid consensus in America about what America was and what its message was. We used to regard what the founders did as an unfinished project, a great start, better than anybody else had ever done, towards a free society, but that they left to subsequent generations to continue to improve and perfect that system. And now you have a lot of people who say, no, it was rotten from the start. Nothing worth saving. That's become a pretty strong element in America, which is very concerning, because when you stop appreciating the good in your society, then I think we shouldn't be surprised if that good eventually disappears.
One of the pieces of this, to me, is the extent to which our government has been kind of evil.
Yeah,
So,
every day.
you know, we've got this footprint around the world that doesn't seem that great to me. Doesn't seem like it's always in our interests or in the interests of the people that we're
Yeah.
mucking around with. How do you think about what what a healthy American future looks like? In this global world, the world in some sense has shrunk,
Yeah.
and America's role in this world moving forward has gotten confusing.
Yeah.
I think it's gotten confusing for all of us.
Yeah.
And all we have to rely on are these like cartoon character versions of the past that we all have in our minds.
Yeah.
How do you think about the future?
All this is confusing, John, because I think we have lost sight of principles. And so now we're kind of behaving the way Groucho Marx did, a great comedian, but in one of his movies, he says to a group of people, "Those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." In other words, I really don't have any. They'll be whatever you want them to be, and they'll be different for the next group of people. If we were true to our principles, we'd be telling the world, look, not every problem or issue or wrinkle in the world is a responsibility of the American government. And its first responsibility is the safety and security of its own people, not that of every other nation in the world, whether we like them or not. But we don't operate on that principle anymore. Now it's like
Pax Americana.
yeah, and I think a little knowledge of history ought to make one skeptical of that kind of perspective, because that usually breaks down. Pax Romana was not eternal, and it just ended up costing the Roman state enough to eventually bankrupt it.
I mean, it seems like this is part of why I bring this up. We're talking about like, are we Rome?
Yeah,
And I've always been resistant to the notion of American empire,
yeah,
or that we are imperialist. It
Yeah.
just doesn't seem like quite the right. It's like, well, what do you mean we're imperialist? Where are our colonies?
yeah. And
But-
we have a great track record of going to the defense of countries under attack, and then once we solve that issue, we leave. At least World War II to a great extent.
Yeah.
But then we're also in subsequent decades, we're in 160 countries, I think, at last count. We have
Right.
presence of troops or something. What's the purpose of that? How does that contribute to the core function of the American government to protect its own people? I think in the end, it makes it harder to protect ourselves if we're out around the world protecting everybody else. So, no, I think a return to principles of limited government, respect for the rule of law, of minding our own business, in the long run is the best foreign policy.
To what extent does our overextension corrupt us as a country? Like, does it make any difference to me as I live my daily life? Everything's become politicized. We all consume global news on our phones all the time. You see right now the college campuses. I've talked a lot about it on this channel, about the response to the Israel-Palestine war. We got a lot of problems in this country.
Yeah.
It's like, you're not going to go to your graduation in college because of the Israel-Palestine war. Like, maybe these are young people like you that are taken to the streets for Czechoslovakia. I want to be fair to them. Mm-hmm. But there is this, like, we're all being hit by all the problems all the time.
Yeah.
And I think for young people, especially if you haven't been given the role models or the vision of what the good should be, it just seems like the world is like a broken disaster.
One issue that isn't the issue it ought to be, but ought to be very concerning to all of us, is as we've asked the government to take on so many responsibilities that now it's got a $34 trillion national debt, and everything is an opportunity for it to throw money at, it seems. What's happening is government itself has become an arena of conflict.
Yes.
The bigger government gets, the more people feel as though they have to either get in charge of it themselves to keep it at bay, or use it as a tool to go after the people they don't like. And so faction preys upon faction. government is a means of forcibly redistributing other people's money. So we got to get into that process and stake a claim on it and so forth. We're fighting each other all the time through the political process because government now says it's in charge of everything practically. Well, one of the consequences of that is that good people don't want to be a part of it. How often have you run into somebody you know and you think, wow, a person of great integrity, that's the kind of person who ought to be a senator or president. But what do they say? I wouldn't dirty my hands with that.
Right.
So what happens is...
Has that always been true, though? Has it always been that politics is just sort of a bunch of Machiavellian scumbags?
It's always... Scumbags are naturally drawn to it. There's no question about it. But there was a time when I think more good people were also drawn to it. But the bigger that it gets, the more corrupt it becomes, the nastier it becomes. So truly good people are the first ones to say, I don't want to be a part of that. So what do we end up with? The worst of all combinations. A big government run by bad people.
In Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, he's got a chapter, Why the Worst Get on Top.
Yeah.
And it lays out the incentives and sort of the psychology of that. It's like, well, in a zero-sum fight to the death, which every election necessarily is, because there can be only one who wins, the person that's willing to lie and slit throats turns out to have some natural advantages over the person who says, I'm not going to release that because that's just uncouth.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I got this oppo research of my opponent, but it's really a personal matter. But
I think the founders of this country had a lot of reasons to want to limit government. I think this is one of the ones uppermost in their minds. The idea that government inherently is an institution prone to corruption and temptation, power lust, pushing people around, self-interest, using the force of government to achieve it, that they said, keep it small. Whatever you do, keep it small. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the very fact that it tends to attract the worst in us was a big one in the minds of the founders. Keep it small.
There's a quote, I won't be able to remember the full version of it, but Lord Acton said the power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
But then it goes on to say that we should make sure not to let the office sanctify the holder.
Yeah.
I think is the way it goes.
Exactly. We should always remember that everybody in government puts their pants on one leg at a time, like the rest of us. There's nothing about holding public office that says you're to be deified or that you're more right than somebody else. We tend to elevate our politicians. Even at the same time we complain about how rotten they are, we still elevate them to,
right.
We still say, well, you ought to do all kinds of other things for us, even though you're as rotten as the day is long.
It's always amazing the extent to which the cognitive dissonance we all experience. It's like you look at the only people that have less of a approval rating than the U.S. Congress is the news media, and that's actually even more true, I think, with young people. Young people really don't trust the media. Mm-hmm. They don't really trust politicians. What do I, as a father, need to explain to my kids about the way what money is and the way it works? Because they're not going to get it in school.
Yeah.
And increasingly, when they go out into the broader world, the kind of stories they're going to get about what money is from all sides are just crazy.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we can print as much as we want, and then we can just tax it out of the system.
Yeah.
That's modern monetary theory. There's more to it than that, but there's not that much more to it than that. So what is money? How does it work? Why does it matter so much?
Okay. Let me preface my answer, John, by saying that there's another thing that's not taught very much in schools these days, and that is the importance of character. And if you impart to your son the importance of solid character, other things like how he deals with money will tend to take care of themselves. So character still is at the forefront of almost everything we do. When it comes to money in particular, I think I would want a child to know that even though people have come to think that it is properly a government monopoly, that's not where it started. It originated in the marketplace. And like anything else, the presence of choice, competition, and accountability will improve anything. That giving government a monopoly over the creation of money is a devastatingly harmful thing to do in the long run, because governments invariably will abuse that power, like they abuse almost every other power that we give them. So I would encourage them to be open to competing privately issued forms of money. That could be a cryptocurrency. I have my doubts that any that we now know are likely to emerge as a broadly used medium of exchange, but I welcome their presence as a commitment of the marketplace to provide an alternative to government monopoly money. And that inflation is, I would want my child to know that inflation is not rising prices. That's a consequence of inflation. Inflation is an increase in the quantity of money and credit beyond the increase in demand for it. It's manufacturing it out of thin air, which government can do because it's a money monopoly. So don't blame the wrong people for rising prices. Don't blame the store owner. Blame the guy in Washington with his hand on the printing press.
That has been something that's so interesting. I did a video, like a sort of quick little office hours, talking about John Maynard Keynes, whose economics you and I don't particularly like, but in the aftermath of World War I, wrote in this book the economic consequences of the peace quite effectively about this, about the way in which inflation is just a way for the state to steal out of our pockets.
Yeah.
And I think he wrote that not one in 1,000 will understand the origins of the chaos that's unleashed by inflation, and that we will look towards the profiteers to blame them, as we hear in the news today. Oh, it's corporate greed is the cause of inflation. So this is so funny to me. It's like, let me get this straight. Under the past administration, the demon businessman, evil capitalist, corporate greed was lower.
Yeah.
Because that's what you're saying. If inflation's driven by corporate greed, and inflation was like under 2%, then under Donald Trump, greed was lower than under Biden. Like, so we have this rash of corporate greed in the past 4 years. Maybe that's not the right theory.
It's irrational, and they never try to explain it. They just use it as a point of argument to try to win points. Larry White, a brilliant economist at George Mason University, came up with a phenomenal analogy on this very issue not long ago. He said, imagine if there's a rash of plane crashes. All of a sudden, 100 planes today all crash. Would it make sense to say, oh, the cause of that was gravity? Larry said, no, gravity was always present. But something else appeared to change the equation. And that's what requires an explanation. So greed, in the sense of wanting more to one degree or another, is always present. And some have more of it than others. There's no reason to believe it goes up or down based upon who's in the White House. If you define inflation as an increase in the quantity of money, it's a lot easier to point your finger at the culprit, because it's not something you and I do. They call it counterfeiting if you and I do it.
That's right.
But if you look at what the Federal Reserve is doing, then you see there's a direct connection between what it does out of thin air and the result in the economy, which can be inflation or even deflation if they radically move in the other direction. I don't trust government to run money, period. So I'm no friend of the Fed or any other artificial mechanism for government to exert its authority over money.
To have money be issued privately. Isn't that crazy talk? What are you talking about? How could that possibly work, Larry?
Well, look at weights and measures, okay? We know that a foot is 12 inches. We know that a yard is 3 feet. And we know that those measurements are critically important, right? How could you do any feat of engineering if you didn't have precise measurement? Do we then extrapolate from that to say that government should then monopolize the creation of rulers and yardsticks and all kinds of measuring devices? No, we let the market do that. If you create a yardstick and it's exactly 3 feet, you've committed no fraud. Why shouldn't you be allowed to produce it privately? But if you create one that's only 33 inches and you call it a yard, we might have a problem with that. So I would employ, with regard to money, the same rules we apply everything else. As long as you're honest, you don't cheat, you don't commit fraud, you don't create a 30-inch stick and call it a yardstick, then yeah, there's no reason for coercion there.
It's interesting, this argument about what should money look like in the future, because it's like we have, on one hand, we've got Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies that are privately created, but then we also have the move on the other side of the extreme towards central banks wanting to do digital currencies
Yeah.
and dispense with paper dollars. So it's like,
Yeah.
where do you think we're heading here?
Well, I'm an Austrian economist, so I'm very skeptical of any kind of forecast, let alone a suggestion that government should get us there. If you had said in 1900, what's the future of transportation, I might have said probably bigger and smarter horses. But we didn't have any Department of Future Transportation in Washington to tell us what the future ought to look like. And so we had a marketplace that produced all kinds of wondrous things that go in the air and on the land and in the sea. I think that should be our general attitude. I don't know what money should be. I do know that the process of deciding what it will be is something that is best left to the forces of a competitive, choice-driven marketplace, just as it is in everything else. What's the future of your dinner in 6 years? I don't know. There might be some new stuff out there that we don't even know about yet. But I'm not going to micromanage your future, and I don't think anybody else should even try.
You've spent your adult life in education, fundamentally, I would say.
Yeah.
Would you agree? Would you agree
Yes.
with that? What are the 5 books that I should give my child when they're of age to start to grapple with the ideas of society, of economics, of what it means for the world to work? I got 5 books.
Yeah.
What would they be?
Oh, boy. Well, in economics, I think a great opener, if he's not already well-schooled or well-read in economics, is the classic by Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. Another book by the great French economist and statesman Frederick Bastiat is called The Law, and it's a great explanation of what it is government ought to do and what it should not do, what its proper parameters are. And then I think a person ought to devote part of his life to self-improvement, not just knowing more, but improving his own self, his character. Dale Carnegie's classic How to Win Friends and Influence People is still a very good one. But I recently ran across one that's just as good, I think, by Olivia Cabani, Cabane. It's called The Charisma Myth. And the myth she's trying to respond to is the idea that, charisma is something either you're born with it, you either have it or you don't. But she points out, no, there are things you can do to make your personality appealing to others. And I found a gem on every page. So as a self-improvement book, there are a few that I think are better than that one. Then I would say, since we have focused in part on spiritual matters, I would say Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter is a splendid book. He wrote this book from a standpoint of a skeptic who decided to pursue his journalistic talents and find out, whether there really was anything to this idea that Jesus existed and was who he said he was. Came to the conclusion, in fact, that he did, and he was, he was who he said he was, and that there was truth in the gospel. But it's presented in a way that is, I think, very appealing. He doesn't say, hey, get this, memorize it, and don't question it. Marvelous book that you can read practically in an evening, More Than a Carpenter.
Any runners-up? That was a great 5, covers the gamut.
Well, we talked about biographies of great people. If you're not into, one big 400-page biography of one person, I would say get my Real Heroes book because it's 40 short chapters on 40 people that deserve recognition. Almost anything by Eric Metaxas, I highly recommend. He's a New York philosopher and historian. His book, a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran pastor who resisted Hitler at the expense of his own life. Great biography, as is another by Metaxas on William Wilberforce called Amazing Grace, and it focuses on the parliamentarian in Britain who led the effort in Parliament to abolish slavery.
I ask this of every guest. He's called the show Dad Saves America. Partly because I want to try to save America, but I think we are all called as men, in particular, to try to be the best we can. And I think the best role you can pick is being a dad.
Yeah.
And I think in embracing that role, you set yourself up to save the country in ways that are more impactful than just about anything else you can do.
Yeah.
It's not for every single person, but it's for most. How do you see your role in this American story?
I think we should be more alert to teachable moments. I look back on my time with my father, who passed away in 1990, and I can think of so many moments that I think he saw as teachable. I didn't at the moment really appreciate it fully, but he did. And by the example that he set, he greatly affected my life. I remember fishing with him on the Beaver River once in western Pennsylvania. We came back and docked the boat at the dock, and he dropped his wad of keys in the water, about 5 feet of water at dockside, and there were a couple kids who were swimming not very far away, and he motioned for one of them who came over, and he said, "I dropped my keys. Can you get them?" And well, the kid did, and my dad didn't just say thank you. He pulled out a $20 bill, which back then would be like $50 today. We weren't a wealthy family, but that was his way of saying, when someone does something good for you like that, when they really didn't have to, you owe them more than a thanks. So it's made me a generous tipper over the years. But
I agree.
in a million ways like that, he saw a teachable moment and left a mark because of what he did.
Larry, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.